Chapter 5, Path to Defending World Civilization. The war, in any form, is the most barbaric activity and should never be glorified, because all warfare started by those in power, and it is mainly innocent people who suffer a lot. The primary purpose of the establishment of the United Nations was to prevent the war. To ensure that this purpose is fulfilled, the United Nations must have absolute authority over its member countries and must implement the highest levels of democracy and justice internally. The current United Nations was created by the victorious nations of World War II, the Allies. Over the past 70 years it has drifted further away from its original mission, continuing to follow a tradition of autocratic rule where power determines right. There is no democracy or fairness to be found at all. Take, for example, reflections in war. Why is it that only the victorious nations are allowed to unilaterally judge and punish the defeated nations? Are there no war criminals among the victorious countries? Why has the United Nations never tried or punished crimes of the Soviet occupation of Poland or the Katyn massacre? Why didn't the United Nations condemn the collusion between Britain, France, and Hitler to oppress Czechoslovakia before the war? Did the military and civilians of the victorious nations never commit crimes against the people of the defeated countries? As far as I know, there were so many German ladies, young or old, were raped by Allied soldiers, especially Soviet soldiers. There is no mention of these crimes by the United Nations, let alone conviction or restitution. Is this fair? Do the people of the defeated nations accept this? The truth is that they do not. Under pressure, they may only express outward submission and endure, but after many years, when the international situation changes, these nations' people, often driven by a desire for revenge from past humiliations, may rise again under the influence of certain nationalist or populist leaders, reigniting conflicts and starting wars. History repeats itself, and disasters reoccur. Thus, it is both necessary and urgent to rebuild a democratic, just, rule-of-law-based, and powerful new United Nations, and UN. The current awkward situation. 1. The United Nations owns no land. Its headquarters is permanently located in a place rented from the United States, as if the U.S. is holding the emperor hostage to command the vassals. 2. The United Nations has no real armed forces or police, making it ineffective and lacking authority. In major incidents, especially those involving the interests of powerful countries, it has no means or measures to act. At best, it offers symbolic gestures, blaming one's side as unjust, or serving as a neutral mediator with no real principles. More often, the United States has been taking in the role of the world's police. Even if it is justified, its actions are seen as an unjustified interference in other nations' affairs, labeled as hegemonism. 3. The United Nations lacks financial resources. Often, it depends on contributions from member countries to operate. Some countries have even delayed or failed to pay their dues, leaving the UN's finances in a tight spot. 4. The United Nations is poorly managed and its staff is difficult to supervise. Many workers act with enthusiasm or driven by their national interests, making it hard to be impartial and efficient. Moreover, under threats or temptations, it is difficult to ensure these employees are not bought or manipulated by certain countries or regimes, becoming their mouthpieces or even spies. There's no doubt that the United Nations is full of internal power struggles and espionage. Currently. 5. Despite representing democracy and justice, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council still operate under the outdated and reactionary systems of lifetime positions and hereditary succession. The US, UK, and France have held permanent positions since the UN's creation, and the other 2 seats have changed in name only. Russia replaced the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China replaced the Republic of China. Why? Is it because of power, because the big can bully the small? Because those with wealth can act without restraint? This is so unreasonable. The major powers control absolute discourse, and weaker nations are relegated to subordinate roles, always acting according to the wills of the powerful nations. If a nation does not comply, sanctions, blockades, or even military interventions will follow, forcing it to submit. No wonder the world curses the 5 permanent members as the 5 rogue nations. 6. The United Nations plays a minimal role but is a bloated organization, full of inefficiency. Its official staff exceeds 110,000, with tens of thousands of temporary staff and volunteers, resulting in huge expenses. Therefore, each year it must rely on its budget to request funding from member countries, which is always a difficult and monotonous task. The vision for rebuilding the United Nations. Yes, you didn't mishear, it is a rebuilding, not a reform. This task should be spearheaded by the United States, calling on and mobilizing the rebuilding of a democratic and just United Nations. The democracy and rule of law that the United States enjoys today should be credited to the great founders led by George Washington. These pioneers were well-off, intellectual, well-armed. And, most importantly, they did not seek to become emperors or establish hereditary systems. Instead, they led the push for democratic reforms in the United States, which is a monumental achievement. Because of this, America today is a true democracy, a model of freedom, and an advanced, strong nation. The world now praises the United States as a beacon of democracy and a model of civilization. Americans should look to their founding leaders as an example and not become complacent, relying on their immense strength to undermine global democratic principles. The American people should start with rebuilding the United Nations, guiding the entire world toward democracy, the rule of law, and prosperity. Detailed rebuilding vision. 1. Mobilize all nations and independent regions to join the new United Nations, referred to as member states. Member states would pay an annual membership fee of approximately 100,000 of their GDP from the previous year. 2. The United Nations should legally own all land, islands, seas, airspace, and outer space on Earth, except for territories belonging to sovereign states and their adjacent waters. All member states may equally conduct scientific research and exploration within the United Nations domain, but they must obtain authorization from the UN and pay certain fees. Navigation is free but requires notification. 3. The United Nations headquarters can be constructed either in its own lands or in the area rented from the member countries. 4. The United Nations General Assembly, House of Representatives, would consist of 5-10 representatives, aged 30-60, from each member state, with each country's expenses covered by themselves. The UN General Assembly would periodically and democratically elect 10 members from the Assembly for the Security Council, Senate, 1 President, 2 Vice Presidents, and 9 members for the Elders Council, Supreme International Court. These 3 branches would function with checks and balances. All the members and the officials would serve for 5 years, with a maximum of 2 terms. Elders Council members can be re-elected more than twice, with a minimum age of 50 years and a retirement age of 75. Other staff, aside from the representatives, would be full-time employees, with excellent salaries, free accommodation, and jobs and schooling arrangements for their immediate families. 5. Recruit and form a real UN peacekeeping force of 1 million elite troops, with additional mercenaries available if necessary. Form a true global special police force of 200,000, recruiting orange excellent police officers from member countries if necessary. The UN's military and police forces would be equipped with the most advanced weapons and technology, focusing on naval and air forces, with small ground and space forces. Except for the military and police, the total number of staff in UN agencies does not exceed 1 million, among which the number of journalists is no less than 50,000. Each journalist conducting field investigations must be accompanied by at least 5 special police officers for protection. This because all UN resolutions and actions rely on the truth, will field investigations and authentic reports of journalists are the most crucial, yet also the most susceptible to risks. 6. The United Nations would urge and oversee all member states to implement disarmament to curb the costly and wasteful arms race, agreeing on a disarmament timetable and scale. The new United Nations would possess legitimate and powerful armed forces and police to maintain justice and defend civilization, so member states would no longer need to spend vast sums on large national defense forces, only maintaining small security forces for daily management and emergencies. 7. The United Nations has the legal right to intervene in the domestic affairs of all member states and help fight against tyranny, whether within or outside the UN. 8. The United Nations can recruit temporary service personnel as needed, encouraging volunteers to participate in global poverty alleviation and relief work, and reward active participants. 9. Each year, recruit around 50 boys and 50 girls from member states for bilingual, English plus native official language, or trilingual, including language of the nation, education. Conditions: healthy in body and mind, from disadvantaged social backgrounds, aged 810. Education would include 3 years of middle school, 3 years of high school, and 6 years of university, including 2 years of strict military training in reserve. Students would major in military/police, political management, journalism, or public service at the university level. 10. The United Nations has the authority to abolish or dissolve any other international institutions or organizations that duplicate or conflict with its own. 11. Retired United Nations staff will enjoy superior benefits and security compared to regular national civil servants and may choose any country to live out their retirement. 12. The United Nations working language will be English, and all full-time staff must be proficient in English. 3. Conclusion. The United Nations was established at the end of World War II, after the horrific devastation caused by the war left people with lingering fears. The world longed for permanent peace. Thus, the leaders of several allied nations, after several rounds of consultations, established the United Nations with great foresight. The initial vision was to create a third-party authority that could mediate conflicts between countries or regions peacefully, instead of resorting to war, a barbaric means of resolving disputes. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning of this article, due to various reasons, the United Nations today is a puppet organization manipulated by major powers, and from the very start, it has not played a significant role. It has almost become a mere decoration. More often than not, it acts as an accomplice when big countries bully smaller ones. International disputes are still resolved by force, or by exchanging land for peace, improving human rights in exchange for international aid, or changing regimes in exchange for economic development. The result is that although large-scale global wars have not occurred, regional conflicts have never ceased. 5 Middle East wars, the Korean War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War, the Sino-Indian War, the Sino-Vietnamese War, the Sino-Soviet conflict, the Falklands War, the 81 Strait crisis, the South China Sea crisis, the Kosovo War, and the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, among countless others. There have also been internal revolutions and repressions, like the Prague Spring, African coups, and various ethnic and national conflicts, along with smaller-scale wars. Let us not forget the genocide carried out by communist regimes like the Khmer Rouge. The tyranny of authoritarian governments over their people has not fundamentally improved. What role did the United Nations play before and during these events? The answer is none. Occasionally, it has made statements of condemnation or imposed some sanctions, but has this been effective? Under the manipulation of major powers, the United Nations cannot substantively resolve disputes. On the contrary, major powers use these disputes to further their own interests. Every decision made by the United Nations under the control of a few major powers is driven by their own national or factional interests. Let's take the Korean War as a simple example. The conflict was initiated by Communist North Korea, and under the authorization of the United Nations, they ushered a coalition of more than 10 countries to intervene. But what was the final outcome? The Western powers led by the Ushad-to compromise with the CCP in the end. What were the two permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the Soviet Union and the Republic of China, doing at the time? The Soviet Union was secretly encouraging and supporting North Korea, or it could be prevent that. The Korean War was instigated by the Soviet Union. Even the so-called independent CCP was supporting North Korea under Soviet directions, order, or even coercion. The most pitiful part of the story was the Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek, the president, repeatedly requested to send troops to participate in the United Nations forces but was repeatedly denied because the United States disagreed. So, was the United Nations decision based on the United States' wishes? The permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, despite their reluctance, had to comply with the United States' will. Ultimately, they had to rely on the U.S. grace to obtain a few tens of thousands of Chinese prisoners of war, which gave Chiang Kai-shek a bit of face. It's clear that when small countries, not permanent members, face crises, do they have any real say in the United Nations? In fact, behind many regional conflicts or international disputes, we often see the involvement of major powers. While these powers publicly use the United Nations to promote justice and maintain peace, secretly, they are driven by their own interests and are willing to provoke conflicts and condone injustice. At the very least, war and armed conflicts ensure that their weapons areas hold well. Which major power among the permanent members hasn't become rich through the development and trade of weapons? Unfortunately, many weak countries and people under authoritarian regimes, who place their hopes in the United Nations to uphold justice, often end up with greater disappointment. Therefore, the United Nations today is essentially a puppet organization, even a corrupt arena for fame and fortune. It has absolutely failed to resolve disputes or maintain justice and peace. It needs to be rebuilt. Must we wait until the Third World War breaks out before we think about rebuilding a real United Nations? By then, it may be too late because the Third World War will likely involve nuclear warfare, and once a global nuclear war breaks out, human civilization might need to be rebooted. The question is, do we rebuild the United Nations, or do we reboot human civilization? I believe that people with sound judgment and normal intelligence quotient will make the right choice. However, before the correct decision is made, I still need to raise my voice loudly. First, I call on all overseas pro-democracy activists to commit to the goal of rebuilding the United Nations. Without a powerful United Nations, who will help us clarify truth and expose the CCP's sins? Who will help the persecuted seek justice and achieve fairness? It's like a woman suffering from domestic abuse, who runs to her neighbor for help. Will that be effective? The neighbor might provide temporary refuge out of humanitarian concern and even condemn her husband, but the neighbor has no real power or qualification to interfere in domestic matters. Her unreasonable husband won't listen, and might even argue with the neighbor, accusing her of infidelity. The neighbor, either out of helplessness or ulterior motives, might gradually neglect her or even encourage her to return home. What should she do? What she needs most is a judicial authority, representing true public power, to protect her rights and punish the wrongdoer. Similarly, for overseas pro-democracy activists, the only entity capable of safeguarding our rights, helping to seek justice, punishing evildoers, promoting goodness, and fostering democracy and rule of law in our home country is a strong and newly built United Nations. Second, I want to remind the Falun Gong practitioners to think about it. Without freedom of speech, the right to associate and protest, or freedom of the press, how can we get truth without a democratic society under constitutional rule? Who will safeguard goodness? Under the brutal oppression and exploitation of CCP authoritarian regimes, even to the extent of barbaric persecution, physical extermination, and organ harvesting, why should we still choose to endure? Therefore, only by advocating for and rebuilding a truly strong United Nations can we ensure that the people living under authoritarian regimes can realize truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Finally, I call on the democratic countries led by the United States to actively advocate for and support the rebuilding of a strong United Nations. This would make it easier for democratic nations to supervise and assist countries still under autocratic rule. Only through a new United Nations can we legally help those backward nations improve people's livelihoods, protect civil rights, and gradually transition to democracy and the rule of law. Otherwise, under the current weak United Nations system, authoritarian countries often close their doors, making it impossible to intervene in their domestic affairs unless war is waged. However, launching a war against a sovereign nation is often seen as unjust and widely criticized. Rebuilding a strong United Nations is also crucial to ensuring that civilized nations are not infiltrated by autocratic ideologies. We must prevent a few ambitious individuals and corrupt elements from attempting to restore autocracy in democratic countries. Civilization is fragile, human nature even more so, and once barbarism puts on the guise of deception, it can easily fool civilization, which often crumbles under the pressure. Too many painful lessons from history. In conclusion, only by rebuilding a democratic, just, and powerful new United Nations can ultimately safeguard the progress and development of human civilization worldwide and effectively prevent barbaric regimes from destroying, eroding, or even annihilating human civilization again.